Some winter horror stories don't end with answers. No suspects, no explanations. Tonight, you will hear 10 real winter horror stories that were never explained. Cases where something clearly happened, but no one ever discovered why. Story 1. Road that went silent. I should have known something was wrong when the GPS tried to reroute me 3 times in 10 minutes. It was February, somewhere deep in the backwoods of northern Idaho, and I was hauling freight from Spokane to Missoula. The kind of run I had done 100 times before. The kind of route that lets a trucker's mind wander, thinking about bills, divorce papers, anything but the endless black ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. But that night, my phone kept insisting I take the next exit, avoid Highway 47, choose literally any other path. I ignored it. I had a schedule to keep, and that old road cut my trip by 40 minutes. That was my first mistake. The locals call it the silent road now, though nobody will tell you why to your face. They just look away when you mention it, change the subject, suddenly remember something urgent they need to do. I learned that later, after everything happened, when I tried to find answers. But on that freezing February night, all I knew was that the highway stretched empty before me, darker than any road should be, even at 2 in the morning. The silence hit me first. I had been listening to a true crime podcast, some disturbing story about missing hikers in the Appalachians, when my phone, this audio cut out. Not gradually, not with static or warning, just gone. I glanced at the screen. Full signal, full battery. The podcast was still playing according to the app, the progress bar moving forward, but no sound came through my truck's speakers. I tried the radio next. Every station delivered the same eerie quiet, not even the hiss of dead air, just absolute nothing. Then my engine noise changed. It took me a moment to realize what felt wrong. The steady rumble of the diesel engine, the sound that had been my constant companion for 15 years of long-haul trucking, had become muffled, distant, like someone had wrapped the entire cab in thick blankets. I could still feel the vibrations through the steering wheel, still see the RPM gauge responding normally, but the sound itself had been swallowed by something I could not see or understand. The headlights showed me empty road. Nothing else. No reflective signs, no mile markers, no roadkill, not even the usual scatter of debris that accumulates on any highway. Just clean, dark asphalt disappearing into darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I checked my mirrors. The red glow of my taillights looked wrong somehow, dimmer than they should be, like they were shining through fog even though the night was crystal clear. Behind me, the road I had just traveled was already invisible, swallowed by shadows that felt almost hungry. My phone buzzed. A text from my dispatcher. "Where are you? Your GPS signal dropped." I looked at the screen. The map showed my truck as a gray ghost on a road that the map claimed did not exist. According to my phone, I was driving through empty forest, miles from any highway. That was when the fear started to creep in, cold and unsettling. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 75. The engine should have been roaring. Instead, I heard almost nothing. Just that muffled, underwater quality that made my skull ache with wrongness. The trees alongside the road were motionless. Not a branch swaying, not a leaf trembling. Like a photograph, like the whole world had frozen except for my truck rolling forward through this nightmare corridor. Then I saw the other vehicles. They appeared in my headlights one by one, spaced about a quarter-mile apart, all pulled over on the shoulder. An old sedan, a minivan with a child's car seat visible through the rear window, a pickup truck with a camper shell, each one dark, empty, driver's door hanging open. No broken glass, no signs of struggle, just abandoned, like the occupants had simply decided to step out into the freezing night and walk away into the trees. I counted 9 vehicles in total before I stopped checking. 9 cars abandoned on a road that locals avoided, on a highway where no official incidents were ever recorded. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I wanted to stop. God, I wanted to slam on the brakes and turn around. But something deep and primal in my brain screamed at me to keep moving forward, to not stop, to never stop on this road. Some ancient survival instinct that recognized predatory territory when my conscious mind still refused to accept what was happening. The temperature inside my cab began to drop. I had the heater running full blast, but I watched my breath start to fog in front of my face. The windows developed frost patterns on the inside, delicate and beautiful and terrifying. They formed too quickly, spreading across the glass like frozen fingers reaching, grasping. Within minutes, I could barely see through the windshield. The defrost did nothing. The heat did nothing. The cold was coming from somewhere else, somewhere the heater could not touch. That is when I noticed the road itself had changed. The asphalt looked older somehow, cracked and weathered in a way it had not been just minutes before. The yellow center line was faded almost to nothing. Potholes appeared, forcing me to swerve. My headlights caught the edge of something massive in the trees, something that moved parallel to my truck, keeping pace. I could not see it clearly, just an impression of enormous size, of limbs that bent at wrong angles, of movement that was too smooth and too deliberate to be natural. My phone buzzed again. Multiple texts now. My dispatcher, my ex-wife, my brother, all asking where I was, all saying my GPS signal was gone, all asking if I was okay. The last message made my blood turn to ice. It was from a number I did not recognize. All it said was, "Stop the truck. Get out. Walk into the trees." Everyone does eventually. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat like it had burned me. The road began to curve, long sweeping turns that my headlights could not fully illuminate. The darkness beyond my lights felt alive now, watching, waiting. I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I tried to look directly at them. The frost on my windows was spreading, creating patterns that almost looked like words, like warnings I could not quite read. Then my engine died, not sputtering, not coughing, just instant silence and loss of power. The truck began to coast, momentum carrying it forward as I pumped the brakes, pulled to the shoulder, every horror movie scene flashing through my mind. Do not stop, do not stop, do not ever stop, but physics does not care about fear. The truck rolled to a complete stop. I sat there in the freezing darkness, watching my breath fog, watching the frost crawl across every surface, listening to the silence so complete it made my ears ring. Outside, the thing in the trees had stopped moving. It was waiting. I could feel its attention like pressure against my skin. My hand was on the door handle when I saw them. Footprints, appearing in the frost on my windshield. From the outside, small, bare feet, child-sized, walking across the glass from right to left, leaving perfect impressions in the ice. I watched them form, one after another, crossing my field of vision. No child, no body, just the footprints, pressing down on the outside of my windshield like something invisible was walking across my truck. Then handprints joined them, dozens of them, pressing against every window, forming in the frost, surrounding my cab. Adult hands, children, hands too large to be human, all pushing against the glass from outside, leaving their frozen marks, testing the barriers. I screamed. The sound was swallowed by the silence. I could feel my voice leaving my throat, but the air itself seemed to eat it before it could become sound. Then the engine started, by itself. The diesel roared to life, breaking that terrible quiet, and the headlights brightened, pushing back the darkness. The handprints on my windows began to fade. I did not hesitate. I slammed the truck into gear and accelerated, tires spinning on the frozen shoulder before finding traction. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90. I was going too fast for the curves, too fast for safety, but stopping was death, and I knew it with absolute certainty. The trees fell away. The darkness lifted. Suddenly I was on normal highway again, and a green sign reflected in my headlights. Entering Montana. Welcome. My radio crackled to life mid-sentence. A weather report warning of freezing temperatures. My phone's GPS snapped back to reality, showing me exactly where I was supposed to be. Like nothing had happened. Like those 40 minutes had been a bad dream. I pulled into the first truck stop I found and sat there shaking until dawn. Other drivers looked at me strangely, but nobody asked questions. That is the code of the road. We all have bad nights. We all see things we cannot explain. We all have routes we refuse to take again. I reported the abandoned vehicles. The county sheriff's department sent a patrol car to check. They found nothing. No cars, no evidence anyone had been there. The road was empty, clean, normal. They suggested I had been tired, that I had maybe gotten confused about which highway I was on. But I know what I saw. 6 months later, I was in a diner in Coeur d'Alene when I overheard two old men talking. One mentioned Highway 47. The other went quiet, then said something that made my blood freeze. That road went silent back in '73. Winter night, whole convoy of vehicles just stopped. 14 cars, 42 people. They all got out and walked into the trees. Every single one. Police found the vehicles the next morning. Doors open, engines still warm. Never found any of the people. He paused, taking a sip of coffee. Strange thing was, After that night, cars stopped breaking down there. Stopped having accidents. That stretch went from the deadliest highway in the county to the safest. No official incidents recorded in 50 years. But locals know better. We do not use that road. We do not talk about it. And if you absolutely have to drive it, you do not stop. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, no matter what walks across your windshield in the freezing dark. The other man nodded. Heard it. It's hungry, he said quietly. Heard it. It's waiting for enough people to satisfy it. Heard when it gets what it needs. That road is going to run red with horror again. I left money on the counter and walked out. I do not haul freight through Idaho anymore. I take the long routes now, the busy highways, the roads where other trucks pass by every few minutes. My dispatcher thinks I am being difficult. My company thinks I am paranoid. But sometimes, late at night when I am driving through darkness, I see frost forming on my windshield. I see small footprints appearing in the ice. And I remember that silence. That terrible, hungry silence that swallowed sound and light and 42 people who made the mistake of stopping. The road is still there, still empty, still waiting, and somewhere in those Idaho woods, something patient and ancient and unspeakably evil is counting down to the night when it will feed again. Story 2. Cabin that was never locked. I found something in the mountains last February that I wish I could forget. Something that still wakes me up at night, drenched in sweat, listening to every creak in my house. The thing is, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was just trying to escape my life for a weekend, clear my head after the divorce. Instead, I stumbled onto something that proved some doors should stay closed, some questions should never be answered. The cabin appeared through the snow like a hallucination. I had been hiking for 3 hours through the Cascade Wilderness, following what I thought was a trail but had long since disappeared under fresh powder. My GPS was useless, my phone dead, and the afternoon light was already dying between the pines. Then I saw it, a small log cabin, perfectly intact, sitting in a clearing like it had been waiting for me. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney. Footprints should have marked the snow around it, but there was nothing, just that structure, dark and silent, impossibly alone. The door was unlocked. That detail bothered me immediately, even before I stepped inside. You don't leave a remote cabin unlocked during winter. Not in bear country. Not when you miles from the nearest road. But the brass handle turned easily under my frozen fingers, and the door swung inward without a sound. The hinges had been oiled recently. I could smell it. Inside, everything was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately explain. The cabin was furnished, lived in, but abandoned. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen table, still half full, a skin of mold floating on top that suggested weeks, maybe months, had passed. A newspaper lay folded beside it, dated January 3rd. 6 weeks ago, the headline read something about a missing hiker, but I didn't stop to read it then. I was too busy noticing everything else. Canned food lined the shelves. A pot sat on the wood stove, dried stew crusted to the bottom. Coats hung by the door. Boots stood in a neat row, sizes ranging from small to large. A family had been here. The realization crept over me like cold water. A family had been living here, eating here, sleeping here. And then they had simply walked away, leaving the door unlocked behind them. I should have left immediately. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, hike back the way I came, risk the darkness and the cold rather than stay in that place. But night was falling fast, and I could hear the wind picking up outside, howling through the pines with a voice that sounded almost human. Almost, I told myself I would just wait until morning. Just one night, then I would leave and report this place to the authorities. Let them figure out what had happened here. The bedroom made my skin crawl. 2 sleeping bags lay on the floor, unzipped and spread out like someone had been using them as blankets. Children's drawings covered one wall, taped up in neat rows. Stick figures holding hands, a house with a smoking chimney, a forest with tall trees. Normal kid stuff, except for one drawing in the corner, partially hidden behind the others. I almost didn't see it at first. It showed the cabin, rendered in careful detail for a child's hand. And standing in front of the cabin, barely visible in faded crayon, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, with no face, just a blank oval where the features should be. I stepped back from the wall, my heart hammering. Just a kid. It's imagination, I told myself. Just a creepy drawing. Children draw scary things all the time. It didn't mean anything. But my hands were shaking as I moved back into the main room. And I couldn't stop thinking about that faceless figure. Couldn't stop imagining it standing outside in the darkness, watching the windows. That is when I noticed the journal. It sat on a small shelf near the wood stove, leather-bound and thick. I hesitated before opening it, some part of me understanding that once I read what was inside, I couldn't unread it. But I needed to know. I needed to understand why this place felt so wrong, why every surface seemed to vibrate with a quiet, screaming horror. The first entry was dated November 15th. Finally made it to the cabin. Road was worse than we thought, but we're here now. The kids are excited. Sarah says she saw something moving in the trees on the drive up, but it was probably just a deer. This place is perfect, isolated, peaceful, exactly what we needed to reconnect as a family. I flipped through the pages. The entries continued, describing days of hiking, cooking meals, playing games by candlelight. A normal family vacation. Then, about 2 weeks in, the tone shifted. The kids have been talking about the tall man in the woods. At first we thought it was an imaginary friend thing, some game they were playing. But last night I saw something too. Just a shadow between the trees, impossibly long, moving when nothing should be moving. I told myself it was a trick of the moonlight, but I keep thinking about it, keep seeing it when I close my eyes. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. The door was open this morning. I know I locked it. I know I did, but it was standing wide open, snow blown halfway across the floor. Nothing taken, nothing disturbed, just open. Something knocked on the walls last night. 3 times, then silence, then 3 times again. We didn't sleep. We sat in the main room with the lights on and waited for morning. Sarah wants to leave, so do I, but when we tried to hike out yesterday, we couldn't find the trail. Every direction looks the same. The trees seem to shift when we're not looking. I know that sounds insane, but I swear the forest is different now. The landmarks we used on the way in Aaron to where they should be. The final entry was dated January 2nd, one day before the newspaper on the table. The handwriting was almost illegible, scrawled in shaking letters that ran off the edge of the page. It is inside now. It has been inside the whole time. We thought it was outside. We thought if we kept the door locked, if we stayed together, we would be safe. But it was never outside. It was here. It has always been here. It lives in the spaces we're not looking. In the corners, in the shadows between the furniture. And now it's showing us what it really is. The kids see it most clearly. They say it has too many arms. They say it is smiling. I don't want to look, but I can feel it watching us. Feel it waiting. The door is unlocked now. We're going to walk outside. We're going to walk into the woods. We want to come back. It doesn't want us to come back. The journal fell from my hands. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. I looked at the corners, really looked, and for just a second, I saw something that made my breath catch. A thickness to the shadows, a density that shouldn't exist. Like the darkness itself was folded, layered, hiding something just out of sight. I grabbed my pack and ran for the door. I didn't care about the night, didn't care about the cold or the wind or the miles of wilderness between me and safety. I just needed to get out, needed to put distance between myself and whatever lived in that cabin, just blind spots. The door wouldn't open. The handle turned, the latch clicked, but the door stayed shut as if held by invisible hands. I pulled harder, threw my weight against it, felt panic rising in my chest like floodwater. Behind me, the shadows in the corner shifted. Something unfolded. Something that had been watching me since the moment I stepped inside, waiting to see if I would understand, if I would read the journal, if I would finally see what the family had seen. I don't remember breaking the window. I don't remember climbing through or running into the woods. My next clear memory is stumbling onto a logging road at dawn, flagging down a truck, babbling about the cabin and the family and the thing that lived in the spaces between. The driver looked at me like I was insane. He said there were no cabins in that area. The Forest Service had torn them all down years ago after a family went missing. He said people sometimes thought they saw buildings out there, especially when they were lost and desperate. The mind plays tricks, he said, but I know what I saw. I know what I read. And 3 months later, when I finally worked up the courage to look at the photos on my dead phone after charging it, I found something that still makes my blood run cold. I had taken a picture inside the cabin, wanting to document the strange scene. In the photo, you can see the table, the moldy coffee, the newspaper. You can see the journal on the shelf. And in the corner, in the deep shadow near the wood stove, you can see something else. A pale blur, too tall for the space it occupies, with too many angles. And if you look closely, if you zoom in like I did, you can see that it is looking directly at the camera. Directly at me. The authorities never found the cabin. Search parties went out, followed my directions, found nothing but trees and snow. They suggested I had been hypothermic, disoriented. They showed me maps proving no structures existed where I claimed to have been. But I know the truth. The cabin is still there, door unlocked, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble through. Waiting to show them what lives in the places we don, to look. The spaces between. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up convinced my bedroom door is standing open. I know I locked it, but I can hear it, creaking slightly in a breeze that shouldn't exist. And I lie there in the darkness, too terrified to look, wondering if the thing from the cabin followed me home. Wondering if it is standing in my doorway right now, unfolding itself from the shadows, smiling with whatever passes for a mouth. The door to my room is always unlocked in the morning. I never remember opening it, but it is always open. Always. Not every winter mystery leaves evidence behind. Story 3. Running engine. I found a car running in the snow with no one inside, and nobody can explain what happened to the driver. That is where this story begins. Not where I want it to begin. Not where any rational person would want their nightmare to start. But this is what happened, and I need to tell someone before the fear consumes what is left of my sanity. It was February when I took the job at Ridgemont Pass Lodge, a terrifying and forgotten resort nestled in the Colorado mountains. The kind of place that looks beautiful in photographs but feels deeply unsettling when you're actually there. I was desperate for work. My life had fallen apart in Denver. Lost my job. Lost my apartment. Lost any sense of direction. So when the lodge manager hired me over the phone without even interviewing me in person, I should have recognized that as a warning sign. Nobody makes that kind of offer without seeing who you are first. Nobody trusts a stranger that easily. But I didn't. Think about it then. The first week was fine. Boring. Even. Winter in the mountains means the lodge stays mostly empty. A few guests scattered across the 100 rooms, mostly wealthy people who wanted solitude. I worked the front desk. I cleaned hallways. I tried to convince myself that isolation was healing. That mountains meant peace. Then I met the other staff members. There were 5 of us total. Me, a cook named David, a housekeeper named Margaret, a maintenance man named Thomas, and the manager, who went by a single name, Kellerman. None of them seemed quite right, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why at first. They moved through the lodge like they were following a script they already performed 1,000 times. Their conversations never meandered or developed naturally. They asked me questions, but they didn't listen to the answers. Their eyes would glaze over mid-sentence, like they were waiting for their cue to speak again. I tried to befriend Margaret. She was the closest to my age, and I thought maybe we could share meals, talk about the creepy atmosphere that hung over everything like humidity. But whenever I approached her, she would vanish into the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the lawn. Thomas seemed to live down there. I heard him at night, moving through those dark passages, his footsteps echoing up through the walls above my small staff room on the 2nd floor. There was something disturbing about the way those sounds moved through the building. Wrong somehow, like he was walking in patterns that didn't match the tunnel's actual layout. By the 2nd week, I realized something horrifying about the lodge itself. Every single hallway looked identical. The carpeting was the same shade of burgundy. The same landscape paintings hung on every wall. The same sconces with their flickering bulbs created the same shadows. I couldn't navigate properly. I would turn a corner expecting to find the stairs and instead find myself in a stretch of hallway I didn't remember. On 3 separate occasions, I walked past the same window and watched the same deer stand in the same spot in the snow. The same moment, repeating. I asked Kellerman about the building, its layout. His response was clinical and evasive. He told me not to wander. He said the lodge had undergone renovations that hadn't been documented, and he understood that the architecture was confusing. But his smile when he said this, a thin, empty thing that didn't reach his eyes, told me he was lying. The terrifying truth started creeping in slowly. The guests, when I occasionally spotted them, never ate at the dining room, never used the fitness center, never took advantage of any of the amenities that supposedly justified the astronomical price of their stay. They simply occupied their rooms. I would hear them moving above my head at odd hours, their footsteps methodical and purposeless. Back and forth, back and forth. One night, I couldn't sleep. The fear had been building since I arrived. A creeping, unsettling sensation that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I went down to the front desk and looked through the reservation system. 32 rooms were booked. 32 guests, paying thousands of dollars each, staying in rooms they never left. I found myself driving down the mountain road that night. I needed air. I needed distance from the lodge and its identical hallways and its guests that moved like hollow things. The road was empty and winding, dark except for my headlights cutting through the winter darkness. Snow fell thick and silent, the kind of snowfall that muffles the world until you feel like you were the only person alive. That's when I saw the car. It was a black sedan, about a quarter mile ahead of me, parked half on the shoulder with the engine running. No lights flashing, no hazards, just sitting there with its tail lights glowing faintly red, exhaust curling up into the chilling cold. My first thought was that someone needed help. My second thought was a warning in my gut that screamed at me not to stop. I almost drove past, but then I saw the snow around the vehicle, pristine and undisturbed, and something shifted in my understanding of what I was looking at. The ground around that car was completely smooth. Not a single footprint, not a single disruption in the snow leading away from the driver's side door. The door was closed. The windows were dark, obscured by frost, and the engine was running, which meant someone had to have started it recently. I pulled over 50 yards back and approached on foot. The snow crunched beneath my boots, each footstep loud in the silence. My breath came out in clouds of vapor. The engine, its idle, was the only sound. That subtle vibration of a vehicle burning fuel and going nowhere. As I got closer, I could see inside the car. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger seat was empty. The back seat stretched out in darkness, absolutely empty. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. We were deep in a mountain pass, and the snow would block any reasonable connection. I stood there, staring at this impossible thing, a running car with no driver, surrounded by unmarked snow, miles from any town or help. The smart choice was to leave, to get back to my own vehicle and drive away from this nightmare. Instead, I opened the driver's side door. The interior was warm. The heat was running full blast. On the dashboard, the clock read 11:47. The fuel gauge showed the tank was full. There was nothing inside the car. No personal items. No signs of who had owned it. No indication of anything except its existence as a vehicle, isolated and running for reasons I couldn't fathom. I found a registration in the glove compartment. The name was Thomas Morrison. The address was Ridgemont Pass Lodge, Maintenance Department. My hands were shaking as I held that card. The maintenance man, Thomas, the one who walked through the tunnels beneath the lodge at night, his footsteps following patterns that made no sense. I got back to my car and drove. The lodge appeared behind me in my rearview mirror, windows glowing like eyes watching my escape. I told myself I would call the police from town. I would report the running car and the missing driver and the impossible absence of footprints. But even as I thought this, I knew something terrifying. The police wouldn't find that car if they went looking. Or they would find it empty and running, but not in the same place. Or they wouldn't find it at all. The next morning, Thomas was at work, doing his maintenance rounds like nothing had happened, acting as if the previous night was just another night, and he abandoned his vehicle in the snow, running and empty, surrounded by a perfect circle of undisturbed white. When I saw him, I asked if his car was outside. He looked at me with that same hollow, empty expression the others had, and told me he doesn't drive. He lives at the lodge. He always has lived at the lodge. His name wasn't Thomas Morrison. His name was just Thomas, and he couldn't recall ever having a car, or ever being on that mountain pass road. I made a mistake then. I showed him the registration. I pulled it out of my pocket and held it in front of his face and demanded an explanation. Thomas looked at that card like it was written in a language he never encountered. He called Kellerman. He walked away as if nothing was wrong, as if reality itself hadn't fractured around us. Kellerman came to find me an hour later. He told me that I was experiencing the altitude affecting my thinking, that I was confused and disoriented, that people sometimes have episodes when they in high elevations after living in Denver. He said it with such confidence, such absolute certainty, that for a moment I wondered if he was right. If I had imagined the car, If I had imagined finding that registration with Thomas's name on it. But I still had the registration. It was in my jacket pocket. The other staff members began watching me after that. Constantly. Their eyes would follow me from room to room. Kellerman rearranged my schedule so I was working the overnight shifts, alone in the lodge while the guests moved through their rooms above me and Thomas walked through the tunnels below. At 11:47 every night, I would hear his footsteps pass my station. The sound would move from east to west, then east again, then west. Like he was conducting some kind of ritual, retracing the same path endlessly. The terrifying realization came to me slowly, crystallizing over days of observation and dread. The lodge wasn't a hotel. It was something else entirely. The guests weren't guests. The staff wasn't staff. And the mountain pass road with its impossible running car was some kind of threshold. A place where something essential about the nature of reality bent and twisted. I researched the lodge and the library in the small town at the base of the mountain. That's where I found the news articles. The lodge had been closed for 16 years. Shut down after an incident in 2008 when a group of people who worked there simply stopped existing. They went to work one day and never came home. The search lasted weeks. No bodies, no evidence of foul play. Just disappeared, as if they'd never been real at all. The articles didn't mention any guests. Only staff, only employees who had vanished into the building and left no trace. I quit that night. I packed my single bag and drove down the mountain, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't tell Kellerman. I didn't say goodbye to any of them. I just left, abandoned the job and the paycheck and the increasingly horrifying understanding of what that place was. But here is what chills me now, what makes this story unbearably terrifying. It was Margaret who found me as I was leaving. She stood in the doorway of the lodge, and her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just the shape of words, desperately trying to warn me. And then she turned and walked back into the building, disappearing into the hallway that looked exactly like every other hallway. The police found my car abandoned on the mountain pass 2 days later. The engine was running. The driver's seat was empty. The snow around it was completely undisturbed, unmarked by any footprints. No sign of where I had gone or how I had vanished. That is the disturbing part. That's the creeping nightmare truth I've been hiding from for months. I'm still not sure which version of me is telling this story. The one who escaped, or the one that never left. The one trapped in those hallways, walking those endless identical corridors, waiting for 11:47 to come around again so I can perform my part in whatever horrifying ritual keeps us all here. Sometimes I hear footsteps in the tunnels. I recognize the pattern now. It's my own footsteps, echoing from passages I've never seen, following paths that shouldn't exist. And every night at 11:47, I find myself drawn to the mountain pass road. To a car with the engine running. To the moment when I make the choice to stop, to step out, to begin again. The most terrifying question I ask myself is this: have I ever actually left? Story 4. Town that lost power forever. I need to tell you what I found in Ashford before I lose the nerve. Before the fear convinces me that forgetting is safer than remembering. Because something is still out there, in that dark town, and it knows I escaped. 3 weeks ago, I drove through a place that no longer exists on any map. A town where the power went out one winter night and never came back on. Where every resident abandoned their homes within 72 hours, leaving behind food on tables, cars in driveways, and doors hanging open in the freezing wind. The official reports called it a mass evacuation due to infrastructure failure. But infrastructure failure does not explain what I saw. It does not explain the shadows that moved without light, or the horrifying discovery I made in the basement of the last house. My name is David Marsh. I am a freelance journalist who specializes in abandoned places and forgotten American towns. I chase stories that fall through the cracks of mainstream media. Ghost towns, failed communes, places where something went wrong and nobody wants to talk about it. Ashford, Montana appeared in my research like a whisper, a single line in a county record stating that all municipal services had been discontinued as of February 14th. No explanation. Just discontinued. The town sat 40 miles off Interstate 90, deep in the kind of endless Montana wilderness that swallows sound and light. I arrived just after sunset, driving down a 2-lane highway that had not seen maintenance in months. Snow covered everything, pristine and undisturbed. No tire tracks, no footprints, just my rental truck cutting through the white silence. headlights pushing back the darkness that seemed unnaturally thick. The moment I crossed into Ashford, my truck's electrical system flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed, then surged, then settled into an eerie, inconsistent pulse. My phone lost signal completely. Not low signal, 0 bars. The screen went black and would not turn back on, even though the battery showed full charge moments before. My GPS died. The radio dissolved into static that sounded almost like whispering, voices buried beneath the white noise. I switched it off. The main street was a snapshot of sudden abandonment. A grocery store with its door propped open, snow drifting across the entrance. A diner with chairs still pulled out from tables. A gas station with the price display frozen on $3.29 per gallon. Streetlights stood dark against the deepening night. No glow from any window. No smoke from any chimney. The entire town sat in perfect, terrifying darkness. I parked in front of what looked like the town hall and grabbed my flashlight. The beam seemed weaker than it should be, struggling against shadows that felt too thick, too present. The cold bit through my jacket immediately. Montana winters are brutal, but this felt different. This cold had teeth. It crawled inside my clothes and pressed against my skin like something alive. The town hall door was unlocked. Inside, papers covered the floor, scattered as if dropped in a hurry. I picked up a notice dated February 12th, 2 days before the power supposedly failed. It was a memo to residents about a town meeting scheduled for that night. The subject line read, regarding the disturbances. Someone had written in the margin, in shaky handwriting, "It is in the dark. It moves in the dark." My flashlight flickered. For just a second, I could have sworn I saw something move at the end of the hallway. A shape that was not quite right, too tall and too thin to be human. But when my light steadied, there was nothing there. Just an empty corridor and the creeping sensation that I was not alone. I found the police station next. The door was not just unlocked but torn from its hinges, metal twisted as if something impossibly strong had ripped through. Inside, the dispatch desk held a logbook. The final entry was dated February 13th, 11:47 p.m. The handwriting grew increasingly frantic across the page. Multiple reports of movement in residential areas. No visual confirmation. Residents report seeing shapes in windows, hearing footsteps on roofs. No power in northwest quadrant. Spreading. Cold increasing. Officer Reynolds not responding to radio. Officer Chen found his car abandoned on Pine Street. Engine still running. Door open. No sign of Chen. Something is wrong with the darkness here. The entry ended mid-sentence. The pen dragged across the page as if the writer had been pulled away. That was when I heard it. A sound from somewhere outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like a sliding, scraping noise, as if something heavy was being dragged across pavement. It moved slowly, deliberately. I turned off my flashlight and pressed against the wall, peering through the broken doorway. The street was empty, but the sound continued, circling the building. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. My breath came in short, visible clouds. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last few minutes. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows. I waited in the darkness, every muscle tense, fighting the urge to run. The sound passed. Silence returned. But it was worse than the noise. In that silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, unnaturally loud, and beneath it, something else. A low vibration, almost below the range of hearing, that made my bones ache. I needed to find answers. I needed to understand what drove an entire town to flee. The residential area started 2 blocks east. I moved carefully, avoiding the main street, cutting through yards where children's toys poked through the snow and frozen laundry hung on lines like ghost shrouds. The first house I entered belonged to the Morrison family, according to the mail piled behind the door. The interior was a museum of interrupted life. Dinner plates on the table, food molded and frozen, a television remote on the couch, children's homework on the kitchen counter, math problems half finished. But written on the wall in what looked like charcoal or ash were words that made my blood ice over. Close your eyes. It only moves when you look. Every house told a similar story. Rapid departure, terror, and those messages, written on walls, mirrors, sometimes scratched into wooden floors. The darkness has weight. It breathed on me. My son walked into the shadow and I cannot find him. I found journals, dozens of them, residents documenting the final days. A teacher named Sarah Brennan wrote about how the power outage started in one neighborhood and spread like a living thing, block by block, plunging homes into darkness that their flashlights and generators could not penetrate. She described how her neighbor's house went dark while she watched, even though she could hear his generator running. She wrote about seeing him at his window, mouth open in a scream, before he vanished into the blackness of his own home. A mechanic named Robert Chen, possibly the same Officer Chen from the police log, described something he called the presence. He wrote that it arrived with the darkness, that you could feel it watching from the shadows. He wrote that it did not like light, but light could not kill it, only slow it down. His final entry was a single sentence. It touched me. My arm is so cold. But it was in the basement of the last house on Maple Street that I found the truth. And I wish to God I had never looked. The house belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Vance, the town physician. Her home was larger than the others, older, with a storm cellar entrance at the back. The door stood open, snow piling on the stairs leading down. My flashlight was dying, the beam fading to a weak orange glow. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my truck and drive until I hit civilization. But I descended. The basement was a makeshift laboratory. Medical equipment, computers still powered by a generator that had long since died, and walls covered in photographs and notes. Dr. Vance had been documenting everything. The photos showed the town over the course of weeks, but in every image, there were shadows. Shadows that appeared in multiple photographs taken seconds apart, but in different locations. Shadows with no corresponding objects to cast them. In one chilling sequence, a shadow moved across a street, grew larger, and in the final photo, a person was gone. Just their shoes remained. Dr. Vance's notes were clinical at first, then descended into barely coherent horror. She theorized that something had been released during a construction project at the edge of town. Workers had broken through into an old mine shaft that predated Ashford by decades, maybe centuries. Something had been down there. Something that existed in the absence of light, that could move through darkness like water, that fed on electrical current and heat and life. She wrote that it was intelligent, that it learned, that the first night, it had taken only one person. The second night, 3. By the fifth night, it had claimed half the town. People did not just disappear. They were absorbed, pulled into the darkness that was not darkness but something wearing darkness as a skin. She wrote that she could hear them sometimes, voices in the shadows, calling for help in languages that predated English. Her final entry was dated February 13th, written in a shaking hand. It is in the house. I can feel it on the stairs. The cold precedes it like a wave. I sealed the records. Someone must know. Someone must warn others. It will spread. Once it has consumed everything here, it will move. Darkness is everywhere. It just needs a door. We opened a door. God forgive us. It is at the basement door now. The light is failing. The page ended there. I stood in that basement, reading by the dying light of my flashlight, and I felt the temperature plummet. My breath became thick clouds. Frost spread across the walls with supernatural speed, and then my flashlight went out completely. I have never known true darkness until that moment. It was not the absence of light. It was the presence of something else. I could feel it around me, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin. I could hear movement, that same sliding, scraping sound, but now it was inches away. I could feel cold breath on my neck, if breath is the right word for what that thing exhaled. I ran in pure blind panic, crashing into walls, hands outstretched, climbing the stairs by feel. Behind me, the darkness followed, and I swear I felt fingers brush my ankle, fingers that were too long and too cold and too many. I burst through the basement door and into the snow. My truck was 50 yards away. I ran, slipping on ice, falling, scrambling up. The darkness poured from the basement like liquid, spreading across the snow, impossible and horrifying. It moved faster than I could run. I reached my truck and the engine turned over. The headlights blazed, and where they touched, the darkness recoiled. I slammed the accelerator and drove, driving through yards, over fences, anything to get back to the highway. In my rearview mirror, I watched the town disappear behind a wall of absolute blackness that rose like a wave. I did not stop driving until I reached the interstate. I did not stop shaking for 2 days. Now I sit in a motel room 3 states away, writing this account. My phone works again. My truck, this electrical system is normal. But every night when I turn off the lights, I feel that cold. I see shadows move in the corner of my vision. I think it followed me. I think once you have been touched by it, marked by it, It knows where you are. The official story is that Ashford suffered a complete power grid failure and was evacuated for safety reasons. The town is condemned. Access is restricted. But I know the truth. Something lives in that darkness. Something ancient and hungry that we were never meant to disturb. And I know something else. Something that keeps me awake at night with every light in this room burning. I checked my research. In the last 6 months, 3 more towns have been evacuated. Small places. Rural. Each one lost power. Each one went dark. Each one was abandoned within days. It is spreading. The darkness is spreading. And I do not know how to stop something that lives in the absence of light, in the cold places between shadows. I do not know how to kill something that is not alive in any way we understand. All I know is that I need to warn people. I need someone to believe me, because winter is coming. The nights are getting longer. And in the darkness, something is waiting. Something that knows we are here. Something that is so very, very hungry. If you are reading this, if you hear this story, please listen. If your power goes out and does not come back on, leave. Do not wait. Do not investigate. Do not look into the shadows. Just run. Run toward the light and do not look back. Because the town that lost power forever is still there, hidden behind barriers and warnings. But the thing that took it is not contained. It is growing. It is learning. And it is coming. I learned too late that some doors should never be opened. Some darkness should never be disturbed. And some towns disappear for reasons we should be terrified to understand. The lights in my room just flickered. Silence often replaces answers in cold places. Story 5. Tracks that ended too early. The footprints in the snow were small, like a child. Yes, and they stopped in the middle of nowhere with no explanation at all. I found them on December 19th, deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, where I worked as a wilderness ranger. 23 years on the job, and I thought I had seen everything the forest could throw at me. Missing hikers, bear attacks, hypothermia cases that still haunt my dreams. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered that freezing morning when the calls started coming in about the Henderson family. They had gone camping 3 days earlier. Father, mother, and their 7-year-old daughter Emma. Experienced outdoors people, the kind who knew how to respect the wilderness. When they missed their checkout time at the ranger station, we started searching. Standard procedure. Happens more often than people think. Usually just a broken down vehicle or a miscommunication about dates. The scary part was how we found their campsite. Everything was still there. Tent perfectly intact. Sleeping bags laid out. Food supplies untouched by animals. The campfire had burned down to ash days ago. 3 pairs of boots sat lined up outside the tent entrance, which made no sense because it was 20 degrees outside. Nobody walks into December snow in bare feet. Nobody sane, anyway. But the tracks told a different story. A horrifying story that violated every law of nature and reason I had ever known. 3 sets of footprints led away from the camp, heading north into the densest part of the forest. Bare feet in the snow. The impressions were clear and deep, like the people who made them had been walking normally, not running, not stumbling. Just walking with purpose into the frozen wilderness wearing nothing on their feet. I followed those tracks for 2 miles, my heart pounding harder with each step, the fear building in my chest like ice water. Then the first set of prints just stopped. Not at a cliff, not at a river, not at any natural boundary. The mother's footprints, identified by size, simply ended in the middle of a small clearing. 1 step, then nothing. The snow around the final print was undisturbed, pristine, like she had been erased from existence mid-stride. No signs of collapse. No signs of struggle, no signs of turning back. The tracks just terminated in perfect powder snow that showed no explanation for where she went. I stood there staring at that final footprint for a long time, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were showing me. Rangers are trained for search and rescue, for logical thinking, for finding reasonable explanations. But there was nothing reasonable about this. Nothing logical about a human being vanishing between one step and the next. The disturbing reality was that 2 more sets of tracks continued north. I radioed base camp, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay professional. They sent 3 more rangers to my location. We documented everything with photographs and measurements, following protocol even though protocol had no chapter for what we were witnessing. The chilling part was how calm the scene felt. No signs of fear in those footprints. No running. The stride length was consistent, relaxed even, like they were taking a casual walk through the snow in bare feet at 20 degrees. Half a mile further, the father, His tracks ended the same way. One footprint, then absolute nothing. The snow around it was perfect and unmarked, glittering in the weak winter sunlight like diamonds. We checked for sinkholes, for hidden crevasses, for any geological explanation. Nothing. The ground was solid frozen earth beneath 6 inches of powder. My partner Jake, a ranger with 15 years experience, just kept shaking his head and muttering that this was not possible. This was not natural. This was not anything he had training for. That left Emma's tracks. The smallest footprints. A 7-year-old child walking barefoot through freezing snow, and we followed them with increasing dread. The eerie silence of the forest pressed down on us like something alive and watching. No birds called, no wind stirred the branches, just our labored breathing and the crunch of our boots in the snow, following those impossibly small footprints as they led deeper into the mountains. Every ranger in our group felt it, that unsettling sensation of being observed by something that did not wish us well. Emma's tracks continued for another mile, and then they stopped. Same as before, one final footprint in the center of a small grove of pine trees, and then nothing. We stood in a circle around it, 4 grown men who had spent decades in these mountains, and nobody spoke for a long time. The fear was so thick you could taste it, metallic and wrong, like blood in your mouth. That was when we noticed the shadows were wrong. It was noon, clear sky, sun directly overhead. Our shadows should have been short, pooling at our feet, but they stretched long and dark across the snow, pointing north, toward something we could not see. And they were moving, shifting, even though we stood perfectly still. Jake noticed it first, his face going pale, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol on his belt like that would somehow protect us from shadows that disobeyed the sun. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Our breath became thick fog. Ice crystals formed on our eyelashes. The trees around us began to crack and pop from the sudden cold, sharp reports like gunshots that made us all flinch. And in that freezing moment, I saw them. Footprints forming in the snow, appearing one after another, coming toward us from the north. Small prints, Emma's size, but walking backward. The tracks were forming in reverse, emerging from nothing, filling in like someone was rewinding time itself. We ran. 4 experienced wilderness rangers, men who had faced down bears and survived avalanches, turned and ran like scared children. The nightmare was that the backward footprints followed us. I could hear them forming behind me, the soft crunch of snow compressing, getting closer. Jake fell and screamed, a sound of pure terror that I had never heard from him before. We pulled him up and kept running, our legs burning, our lungs screaming in the frozen air. We did not stop until we reached the campsite. The Henderson family tent was gone. Not collapsed, not torn down, just gone. The only evidence it had ever existed was a perfect rectangle of bare ground in the snow. Our photographs showed it clearly. Our notes described it in detail, but it had vanished as completely as the family who had slept in it. That night, back at the ranger station, I filed my report. The other rangers filed theirs. We all wrote the same horrifying details, the same impossible facts. Our supervisor read them and locked the reports in his desk drawer without a word. No search party was organized. No investigation was launched. The Henderson family was quietly listed as missing, presumed dead, case closed. But I could not let it go. I spent weeks researching, digging through old ranger reports, talking to retired forestry workers who would only speak in whispers after checking that no one else was listening. What I learned was chilling beyond words. This was not the first time. Not even close. Every 7 years, somewhere in the Cascade Range, people disappeared the same way. Tracks leading into the snow and stopping with no explanation. Always in winter, always bare feet, always heading north. The pattern went back over 100 years. Families, hikers, hunters, Native American legends spoke of the cold walker, something that lived in the deepest winter, something that called people into the snow and took them to a place between one step and the next. The disturbing truth was that the disappearances were accelerating. What had happened once every 7 years was now happening annually. More people were hearing the call, walking barefoot into the freezing wilderness with that same calm stride. Park services across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho were quietly dealing with cases they could not explain and would not publicize. The danger was spreading, and nobody in authority wanted to admit that something was hunting in our forests, something that left tracks ending too early in shadows that moved against the sun. 3 months after the Hendersons vanished, I was doing a routine patrol near the same area. Late afternoon, overcast sky, new snow on the ground. I was checking coordinates on my GPS when I looked up and saw her. Emma Henderson stood 30 yards away, barefoot in the snow, wearing the same pink jacket she had disappeared in. She looked exactly the same. Not frostbitten, not starved, not injured, just standing there, watching me with eyes that reflected no light at all, like black holes in her small face. My radio crackled with static, even though no one was transmitting. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the air too long, too heavy, like they were solid things trying to drag me down. Emma did not move, but her shadow did, stretching toward me across the snow. Impossibly long, impossibly dark. Then she turned and started walking north. Every instinct screamed at me to follow her. The compulsion was overwhelming, a creepy pull that felt like hooks in my brain, dragging me forward. I took one step, then another. My boots felt heavy. My coat felt too warm. I wanted to take it off. I wanted to remove my boots. I wanted to feel the snow under my bare feet and walk north until I found whatever was calling me. I broke the compulsion by falling to my knees and digging my hands into the snow until the pain shocked sense back into me. When I looked up, Emma was gone, but her footprints remained, leading north, and I knew with absolute certainty that somewhere ahead, those tracks would stop with no explanation at all. I quit the ranger service the next week. My supervisor accepted my resignation without question, without asking why. He just nodded, like he had been expecting it, like he had seen too many good rangers walk away from these mountains with haunted eyes and hands that shook when they talked about shadows that moved wrong. I live in Phoenix now, about as far from snow as I can get. But sometimes, on clear nights, I look north and remember those tracks that ended too early. I remember Emma's empty eyes and the way her shadow moved like something alive. I remember the Henderson family walking barefoot into the freezing wilderness, following some terrible call that only they could hear. The worst part is knowing it is still happening. Right now, somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, someone is hearing that call. Someone is taking off their boots in the middle of winter and walking north with calm, steady steps. Someone is leaving tracks in the snow that will end abruptly, impossibly, with no signs of collapse and no signs of turning back. And someday, when enough people have answered that call, when enough tracks have ended too early, something is going to come walking south out of those mountains. Something wearing familiar faces and leaving footprints that form backward in the snow. Something that knows exactly where to find the rest of us. Story 6. Call that cut off. I was working dispatch the night someone called in screaming for help, and then the line just went dead. That call changed everything. It made me question whether I actually heard what I thought I heard. And it turned me into someone who sees danger in every shadow, every silence, every moment when the world feels too quiet. I am still not sure if I made a horrible mistake that night, or if something far more sinister was happening on the other end of that phone line. Let me back up. I worked as a 911 dispatcher in Millbrook County, Maine. Small rural area, mostly quiet. We get car accidents, medical calls, the occasional domestic dispute. Nothing that prepared me for what happened on February 9th. The weather had been terrifying all day. A winter storm was moving in from the north, the kind that the locals said hadn't hit this region in nearly 30 years. The news was calling it potentially catastrophic. Roads were already becoming dangerous by evening, and travel was strongly discouraged. My shift started at 10 in the evening. The storm was building outside the dispatch center windows, snow falling in thick, heavy curtains that made it nearly impossible to see across the parking lot. The wind howled against the building. The lights flickered twice, and our backup generator kicked in with a deep, reassuring hum. Everything felt ominous and dark, like the sky itself had turned hostile. By midnight, the calls had increased significantly. A jackknife semi on Route 9. A fender bender in downtown Millbrook that turned nasty when the drivers got out and started shouting at each other. A woman reporting a tree down across her driveway. Nothing unusual for severe winter weather, but the volume was steadily picking up. My supervisor, Dale, was monitoring things carefully, watching the storm forecasts on the weather station and coordinating with the state police. Then at 12:47 a.m., a call came through that made my blood run cold. The caller was a man, and he was terrified. His voice was breaking, panicked, barely comprehensible beneath the screaming wind and something else. A sound in the background that I couldn't identify. Something mechanical and wrong and deeply disturbing. He said he was on Miller Road, about 8 miles outside of town, and that something had hit his car. He said a vehicle had come out of nowhere on the dark highway, smashed into his passenger side, and kept pushing him. His car was sliding off the road. He was going to crash. I typed the information as fast as my hands could move. Mile marker 15 on Miller Road. Vehicle collision. Possible injuries. I immediately dispatched the nearest unit, which was State Police Officer Marcus Chen, who was only about 6 miles away. I told the caller help was coming, that he needed to stay on the line and tell me everything that was happening. What he said next still echoes in my nightmares. He screamed that the other car was still pushing him, that it wasn't trying to pass. It was deliberately driving him off the road. He described a vehicle he couldn't quite see through the darkness and the blinding snow. Something large and metallic that seemed to move with a horrifying kind of purpose. The sound in the background intensified. That mechanical shrieking became louder, more urgent, almost like something alive and screaming. I stayed with him, keeping my voice steady even as my hands shook. I told him the police were minutes away. I asked him questions to keep him talking, to keep him conscious and focused. What color was the other vehicle? Did he see the driver? Was anyone else in the car with him? He answered in fragmented, terrified words. He didn't. Do you know the color? He couldn't see inside the other car. He was alone. Then the screaming in the background changed. It became something else entirely. Not the sound of a man in terror, but a sound of absolute, primal horror. A shriek that didn't sound entirely human. And the mechanical noise grew louder, more intense, until the phone line filled with static and the creepy, eerie sound of something I couldn't identify. The line cut out. Not a drop in service. Not a sudden disconnection like a phone call that fails. The line just went dead. 1 second I was listening to the terrifying sounds of whatever was happening on that dark highway. And the next second there was absolute silence. I tried calling back immediately, but there was no answer. No ringing, just a dead connection. I told Dale what had happened and updated the dispatch. Officer Chen was closest and confirmed he was en route to Miller Road at mile marker 15. The storm was getting worse by the minute. The visibility was down to almost nothing. But Marcus was a veteran cop, and he said he could handle the conditions. 30 minutes later, Marcus called in. He reached the location. There was nothing there. No car, no signs of a collision. No skid marks in the snow because the wind kept erasing anything that might have been there. No debris, no body, just an empty stretch of highway in the middle of a screaming blizzard, exactly where the caller had reported the impact. It was like nothing had ever happened. Like the call had been a phantom. Something I imagined or dreamed. But I knew what I heard. The panic in that man, whose voice was real. The terror was real. The mechanical shrieking and that impossible sound at the end was absolutely, undeniably real. We filed a report. We notified the state police and the highway patrol. We checked for any missing persons reports in the county. Nothing. No one reported anyone missing that night. No one called looking for a father or husband or son who hadn't come home. It was like that call had come from nowhere, from a man who didn't exist, describing an accident that never occurred. I couldn't sleep after my shift ended. I went home and sat in my kitchen, replaying the call in my mind over and over, trying to figure out what I actually heard. Was it a prank? Someone who called in to scare a dispatcher during a severe storm? But the fear in his voice didn't sound like acting. The collision sounds at the beginning of the call were real. The way his words became more fragmented and desperate as time went on felt absolutely genuine. The nightmare started 3 days later. I began hearing that mechanical sound again. Not over the phone, not during work, just suddenly, without warning, in the quiet moments of my day. I'd be driving to work and I'd hear it for a second in the static between radio stations. I'd be in the grocery store and hear it echo from somewhere in the building, that creepy, eerie shriek that made everyone around me look up in confusion, wondering if they heard it too. But the worst part was understanding what that sound meant. The more I heard it, the more I became convinced that something had been on that highway that night. Something that wasn't the normal car. Something that hunted in the darkness and the blizzard. Something that destroyed whatever it encountered. Something that made horrifying sounds as it did whatever it was designed to do. I started researching the history of Miller Road. The town records showed that in 1987, there had been a major accident at almost the exact same mile marker. A transport truck carrying industrial machinery had crashed during a winter storm. The machinery had been destroyed. The driver had vanished. They found the truck, but the man behind the wheel had simply disappeared. The official report said he likely froze to death and his body was never recovered because of the storm conditions and the deep woods surrounding that section of road. But I found a police report from that incident filed by an officer named Raymond Hutchins. He'd written that the truck's cab appeared to have been pushed off the road, that the damage pattern was inconsistent with a standard accident, that something had deliberately driven the truck off the highway. I contacted Officer Hutchins. He was retired now, living in Portland. When I called him and mentioned the 1987 accident, there was a long silence on the line. Then he told me something that made the fear crystallize into absolute certainty. He said he'd never been sure what happened that night, but he heard rumors. Local people talked about something on Miller Road, something that appeared during bad storms, something that seemed to hunt vehicles. He tried to laugh it off as legend and folklore, but he'd never forgotten that crash or the way the truck had been damaged. He said there had been other accidents at that location over the years. More than should have been possible. All of them during severe weather. All of them involving vehicles that seemed to have been deliberately forced off the road. I went to the Millbrook County Library and dug through microfiche records of old newspapers. What I found was terrifying and undeniable. 17 vehicle accidents at mile marker 15 on Miller Road over the past 45 years. 7 of them were fatal. The accidents happened in clusters, always during the worst storms, always with patterns that suggested something was deliberately causing them. The official reports were vague and contradictory. Some mentioned mechanical failure, others mentioned driver error, but there were always inconsistencies. There were always details that didn't quite fit the official explanations. The most chilling discovery came in a 1995 article from the Millbrook Gazette. A journalist named Sarah Chen had written about the unusual number of accidents at that location. She interviewed local residents, and they all mentioned something they called the hunter. Not a person, not an animal, something else. Something that came when the weather turned bad and the roads became dangerous. Something that some people believed had been loose on that highway for decades. Sarah Chen had disappeared 3 weeks after her article was published. I haven't worked dispatch since that February night. I told my supervisor I had to quit, and I didn't. To explain why. I can explain why, not in a way that would sound sane. But I know what I heard on that phone line. And I know that the man who called me is still out there somewhere, still caught in that moment when his car was pushed off the road by something unseen and screaming and mechanical and wrong. Sometimes I drive past Millbrook on my way to other places, but I never take Miller Road. I plan my routes to avoid that highway entirely, even though it adds an hour to my drive. And whenever I hear the sound of wind against my car, or a mechanical noise I can quite identify, I grip the steering wheel tighter and I pray that I don't break down in bad weather anywhere near mile marker 15. The most disturbing part is this. About a month after that call, I received a phone message. It came through to my personal cell phone, and the caller ID was blocked. There were no words, just sounds. A car engine, wind screaming, and underneath it all, that mechanical shrieking that I heard on the night of the original call. Someone had recorded the sounds from that highway. Someone had saved them, and someone had wanted me to remember. I still listen to the news from Millbrook County. Every time there's a report of a winter storm moving in, I check for accidents on Miller Road. And they were there, sometimes, reported in brief sentences in the local news. Vehicle off the road, driver missing, cause unknown. The most terrifying thought that keeps me awake at night is this. I wonder if that man who called me on February 9th ever actually made it off that road. I wonder if he is still there, trapped in that moment of collision and horror and darkness. I wonder if the thing that hunts Miller Road is still pushing cars off the highway, still making that horrifying sound, still collecting the people who dare to drive that road when the storms arrive. And I wonder if someday, when another winter storm comes to Maine, another dispatcher will answer a call from that highway. They'll listen to someone screaming. They'll hear that mechanical shrieking, and then the line will go dead, and nothing will ever be found. Some details were never meant to be found. Story 7. Highway mile nobody stops at. I lost 4 hours on Highway 27 last February, and I still cannot explain what happened during that time. But I know something did happen, something horrifying that my mind refuses to remember, and the evidence I found later makes me wish I had never driven that road at all. My name is Tom Hendricks. I am a long-haul trucker with 16 years of experience driving routes across the Midwest. I have seen every kind of weather, every kind of road, and I thought I knew every trick the highway could throw at me. But there is one stretch of road in northern Wisconsin, A single mile marker between exit 73 and 74. Where something is terribly, deeply wrong. Where dozens of drivers have lost time and memory. Where the silence is so complete it feels like the world itself has stopped breathing. The reports started appearing on trucker forums about 2 years ago. Drivers mentioned feeling strange on that particular stretch. Losing minutes, sometimes hours. They would check their clocks before entering that section of highway and check them again after, only to discover that more time had passed than should have been possible. No memory of stopping. No memory of anything unusual. Just missing time and a creeping sense of fear they could not explain. Most dismissed it as fatigue or winter conditions playing tricks on tired minds. I dismissed it too, until it happened to me. It was February 16th. I was hauling refrigerated goods from Milwaukee to Duluth, a route I had driven 100 times before. The weather was clear, temperature hovering around 15 degrees, roads dry and well-maintained. I left Milwaukee at 6 p.m., planning to reach Duluth by 3 a.m. Everything was normal until I approached that stretch of Highway 27. I remember checking my GPS at 9:42 p.m. I was making good time. The road ahead was empty, just my headlights cutting through the darkness and the occasional reflective sign marking the miles. Exit 73 passed on my right. I glanced at the mile marker. Then I glanced at my clock. Still 9:42. The next thing I remember, I was pulling into a rest stop near exit 75, and my clock read 1:57 a.m. 4 hours and 15 minutes had vanished. My fuel gauge showed I had burned through a quarter tank, consistent with driving, but I had no memory of those miles. No memory of anything except a brief, disturbing flash of standing outside my truck in the cold, staring at something in the woods that I could not quite see. The fear hit me immediately. Not confusion, pure, primal fear. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. My heart hammered in my chest. I was covered in sweat despite the cold, and there was something else. Something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn. There were scratches on my hands. Long, thin scratches like I had been clawing at something. Or something had been clawing at me. I pulled out my phone and started researching. I found the trucker forums and read through dozens of accounts. The stories were all chillingly similar. Drivers entering that section of highway. Time disappearing. Waking up miles away with no memory. But there were details that made it worse. Details that suggested something truly horrifying was happening on that stretch of road. One driver reported finding mud on his boots even though it had not rained. Another found his passenger door open when he came to, cold air flooding the cab. A woman trucker discovered a handprint on her windshield, on the inside, that was not hers. The fingers were too long, but the most disturbing account came from a driver named Marcus Webb. He had been traveling that road 3 months before I did. He lost 6 hours. When he finally regained awareness, he was parked on the shoulder with his engine off. His phone was full of photos he did not remember taking. Photos of the woods at night. Photos of something moving between the trees. And one photo, the last one, showed the interior of his cab. In the passenger seat was a shape. A dark, human-sized shape with no features, just a void where a face should be. Marcus never drove that route again. I should have done the same. I should have refused any route that took me near Highway 27. But I'm a trucker. The job is the job. And part of me needed to understand. Part of me needed to know what was happening to us out there in the dark. So when I got another assignment on that road 3 weeks later, I prepared. I mounted a dash cam. I set my phone to record audio continuously. I made sure my GPS tracked every second. And I drove into that terrifying stretch of highway with my eyes wide open and my heart pounding with fear. Everything seemed normal at first. 9:35 p.m. Clear night. Empty road. I approached exit 73 and began narrating into my phone recorder, describing everything I saw. The mile markers, the tree line, the curve in the road ahead, my speedometer steady at 65. Then I felt it, a change in the air pressure, like driving into a tunnel. My ears popped. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, dissolved into static. Not random static, pattern static. Almost like breathing, the temperature inside my cab dropped so fast I could see my breath. My headlights began to dim, not flicker. They faded gradually, as if something was draining the power from my entire electrical system. My dashboard lights followed. Within seconds, I was driving in near complete darkness, only the faintest glow from my instruments. That was when I saw them, figures standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought they were deer or people needing help. But as I got closer, my dying headlights revealed something that made my blood freeze. They were not quite right. Too tall, too thin, standing perfectly still in the freezing cold without winter clothes. Their heads turned to follow my truck as I passed, but I could not see their faces. Just smooth, dark surfaces where faces should be. I pressed the accelerator, but my truck was not responding correctly. The engine sounded wrong, labored, as if I was pulling 10 times my actual load. My speed dropped to 40, then 30. The figures on the roadside multiplied. Dozens of them now, lining both sides of the highway, all watching my truck crawl past. Then my engine died completely. My truck rolled to a stop in the middle of that nightmare mile. Silence fell like a weight. No engine noise. No wind. Nothing. Just that eerie, suffocating quiet that the other drivers had described. The silence of a world that has stopped. I sat frozen in my cab, every muscle locked with fear. Through my windows, I could see those figures moving closer. They did not walk. They glided across the pavement, smooth and impossible. They surrounded my truck. I could feel them pressing against the metal, rocking it gently. The temperature dropped further. Ice formed on the inside of my windows. One of them appeared at my driver's side window. Up close, it was even more horrifying. The shape was humanoid but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too many joints in the limbs, fingers that were too long and too numerous. And that face, that smooth, featureless surface that somehow conveyed an expression of hunger. It raised one hand and placed it against my window. The glass cracked under its touch, spreading fractures across the surface. I could feel cold radiating from it, a cold that went beyond physical temperature. This was the cold of deep space, of the void between stars. That was when my survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my emergency flare from the door compartment and struck it. Brilliant red light flooded my cab. The figure recoiled instantly. The others backed away, retreating into the darkness beyond the flare's reach. My engine suddenly roared to life. My lights blazed back to full brightness. I did not hesitate. I slammed the accelerator and drove, the flare burning in my hand, red light pulsing across the highway. In my mirrors, I watched those figures stand motionless on the road, watching me escape. They did not chase, they just watched. I made it past mile marker 74 and the world snapped back to normal. Radio came back mid-song. Temperature returned to normal. The oppressive silence lifted. I checked my clock. Only 8 minutes had passed. 8 minutes that felt like hours. When I reached the next rest stop, I reviewed my dashcam footage. Most of it was useless, just darkness and static. But there were frames, brief flashes, that showed those figures. And there was audio, my own voice, narrating at first, then going silent. Then, barely audible beneath the static, other voices. Dozens of them, hundreds, speaking in languages I did not recognize, overlapping, crying out. And beneath all of that, a single phrase repeated in English, over and over, "Stay with us. Stay forever. The road never ends." I filed a report with the State Highway Patrol. They were polite but dismissive. No other complaints that night. No evidence of anything unusual. They suggested I had experienced highway hypnosis or fallen asleep briefly. They suggested I see a doctor, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know I am not the only one. I started reaching out to other drivers who reported losing time on that stretch. Most would not talk about it. Too afraid, too disturbed. But a few shared their stories with me. And the pattern became clear. That mile of highway is not right. Something exists there, in the space between mile markers 73 and 74. Something that exists outside normal time. The figures we see, they are not ghosts. They are not monsters in any traditional sense. They are something worse. They are the ones who did not escape. Drivers who lost time and never came back. Travelers who stopped on that road and became trapped in whatever nightmare pocket exists there. One driver told me he recognized one of the figures. It was his uncle, a trucker who disappeared on Highway 27 15 years ago. His truck was found abandoned at mile marker 73, engine running, no sign of the driver. They ruled it a voluntary disappearance. But this driver swore he saw his uncle standing in that dark space, transformed into one of those horrifying shapes, still trapped on that endless mile of road. The most chilling part is what I discovered through traffic data. Accidents on Highway 27 are incredibly rare, almost impossibly rare, but disappearances are not. Over the past 20 years, 47 vehicles have been found abandoned on or near that stretch of road. No drivers, no bodies, no explanations. Just empty cars and trucks with engines running and doors open, as if the drivers stepped out and walked into the night. I think I know where they went. I think they are still there, trapped in that space between miles, in that pocket of frozen time where something hungry waits for more travelers to join them. I do not drive that route anymore. I refuse any assignment that takes me near Highway 27. Other drivers are starting to do the same. The word is spreading through the trucking community. Avoid that road. Avoid that mile. If you must drive it, do it during the day, keep your speed up, and do not stop for anything. But even now, months later, I am not free of it. I have nightmares about those figures, about that suffocating silence, about the cold that felt like it was reaching inside my chest and freezing my heart. Sometimes I wake up and my clock shows missing time, just minutes. But it is happening. I think whatever exists on that highway mile, whatever trap was set there, it marked me. It touched me through that cracked window. And now it knows where I am. It is patient. It can wait, because time means nothing to it. Last week, I was driving through Indiana, hundreds of miles from Wisconsin. I checked into a motel for the night. When I woke up, my truck was covered in frost, even though the temperature was 40 degrees. And written in that frost, in letters a foot tall across my windshield, were 2 words, "Come back." I am writing this as a warning. If you drive Highway 27 in northern Wisconsin, if you pass through that stretch between exits 73 and 74, be careful. Be vigilant. Do not stop. Do not slow down. And if you feel that change in air pressure, if your lights begin to dim and silence falls like a blanket, drive faster. Get through it. Escape while you still can. Because that highway mile is hungry. It collects travelers. And those of us who escaped, we carry a mark now. A connection. We are not free. We are just waiting for the day when the road calls us back and we cannot resist. The horrifying truth is that some roads do not just connect places. Some roads are places themselves. Spaces between spaces. And on Highway 27, between miles 73 and 74, there is a mile that exists outside our world. A mile where time stops and terror waits. I pray I never return there. But every night when I close my eyes, I see those figures standing on the roadside. And I know they are waiting for me. The road never ends. Story 8, shelter that no one used. The emergency shelter at mile marker 73 had fresh supplies, working heat, and a door that was never locked. But every hiker who saw it kept walking into the deadly storm instead. I discovered this horrifying fact while investigating 3 deaths in the White Mountains of New Hampshire last March. My name is David Marsh, and I spent 12 years as a state police detective specializing in missing persons cases in the wilderness. The job teaches you to see patterns, to notice when something does not add up, to trust your instincts when they scream that something is terribly, unnaturally wrong. The shelter was part of a network built in the 1970s, scattered along popular hiking trails to provide emergency refuge during the brutal winters we get up here. Simple wooden structures with bunks, a wood stove, canned food, and blankets. They saved lives every year. Except this one. This one sat empty all winter while people froze to death within a quarter mile of its door. The first victim was Marcus Chan, an experienced mountaineer from Boston who knew these trails like his own backyard. His body was found curled against a boulder, dead from exposure, just 15 minutes walk from the shelter. His GPS log showed he had passed within 50 feet of the building. He had to have seen it. The creepy part was his journal, found in his pack, where his final entry read only, "I would rather die out here than go inside that place." No explanation. No context. Just that single terrifying line, written in handwriting that became increasingly erratic, like his hand was shaking uncontrollably. The second victim was found a week later. Sarah Brennan, a wildlife photographer documenting winter landscapes. Her camera contained hundreds of photos from her final hike, and buried in that collection was a single shot of the shelter, taken from about 30 yards away. I have stared at that photograph for hours, trying to understand what disturbed me so deeply about it. The building looked normal, solid, safe, but something about the image made my stomach turn, made my skin crawl with instinctive fear I could not name. Sarah's body was discovered in a shallow depression in the snow, less than 100 yards from the shelter. She had been trying to dig herself a survival trench when hypothermia took her. The medical examiner noted unusual bruising on her legs and arms, like she had been running and falling repeatedly. Running away from something. Running toward her death rather than toward the safety that was so close. The third death brought me to the shelter myself. Thomas Whitmore was a college kid from Vermont, hiking the trail as part of a wilderness survival course. His professor reported him missing when he failed to reach the next checkpoint. We found his body in a frozen stream bed, and the disturbing reality was that he had been crawling. Not walking, crawling through the snow, away from the shelter, his fingers bloody from clawing at ice and frozen ground. His eyes were open, and even in death, they held an expression of such pure terror that the first responder actually vomited at the scene. 3 dead in 1 winter. 3 experienced hikers who chose to die rather than use an emergency shelter specifically designed to save their lives. I drove up to mile marker 73 on a gray March morning, determined to find answers. The trail was still snow-covered, the forest silent except for wind through bare branches. The shelter appeared suddenly through the trees, exactly as the maps indicated, exactly as it looked in Sarah Brennan's photograph. A simple wooden structure, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with a peaked roof and a single door painted bright red for visibility. Nothing scary about it, nothing obviously wrong, but I felt it immediately. That same instinctive revulsion that makes animals flee before an earthquake. That primal warning system buried deep in the human brain that recognizes danger before conscious thought can catch up. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to get back in my car, to leave this place and never return. I forced myself to approach the door. The red paint was fresh, applied within the last year according to maintenance records. The door hung straight on its hinges. Through the single window, I could see the interior looked clean and well-maintained. Supplies were stacked neatly on shelves. The wood stove sat ready with kindling prepared in a metal box beside it. Everything exactly as it should be. I reached for the door handle. My hand stopped 6 inches away, trembling, refusing to move closer. The fear was overwhelming now, crushing, like invisible hands squeezing my chest. My vision started to blur at the edges. My ears filled with a sound like distant screaming, though the forest around me was completely silent. Sweat ran down my back despite the freezing temperature. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell was wrong with me? I was a trained detective, a rational man, and I was having a panic attack over a wooden shelter in the woods. It made no sense, but sense or not, my body refused to go near that door. I circled the building instead, looking for anything unusual. The windows were intact, the walls showed no damage. The chimney was clear. Behind the shelter, the forest pressed close, and I noticed something odd about the trees. They grew away from the building, branches all angled outward like they were trying to escape. Even the underbrush stopped about 10 feet from the back wall, leaving a perfect circle of bare ground. That was when I found the marks. Scratches, hundreds of them, carved into the back wall of the shelter, hidden from the trail, where only someone walking completely around the structure would see them. Names, dates, messages. The wood was covered with them, overlapping, some so old the grooves had darkened with age, others fresh enough that splinters still showed white. The most recent read, "Do not go inside. It knows your name. It knows what you fear most." Dated 2 weeks ago, the day before Thomas Whitmore died. My hands shook as I photographed the wall, documenting every mark, every message. They went back decades. The oldest I could make out was from 1978, the year after the shelter was built. Something lives in the walls. Can hear it moving at night. Better to freeze. I spent 3 hours cataloging those messages, and the pattern that emerged was absolutely chilling. Every few years, sometimes every season, someone would carve a new warning. Not teenagers playing pranks. These were desperate messages. Scratch marks from people using rocks or knives or their own fingernails to leave warnings for whoever came after. The door locks from the inside but not the outside. Heard my dead mother calling from the crawl space. Shadows move wrong in there. It promises warmth but delivers something else. The disturbing part was how many people had known. How many hikers had seen these warnings, read these messages, and then made the same choice as Marcus Chen and Sarah Brennan and Thomas Whitmore. Made the choice to risk death by exposure rather than spend even 1 minute inside that shelter. I had to know what was in there. Professional duty demanded it. 3 people were dead. More would die if I did not figure out what was happening. I pulled my service weapon, chambered around, and approached the red door again. The fear hit me like a physical wall, but I pushed through it, gritting my teeth, forcing each step. My hand closed on the door handle. The metal was ice cold, so cold it burned. I pulled the door open. The interior looked exactly like it should, exactly like the photographs in the maintenance reports. 6 bunks with thin mattresses, shelves with canned goods and bottled water, the wood stove, a table and 2 chairs. Nothing creepy. Nothing unusual. Except the smell. It hit me the moment I stepped inside. Not decay or rot or anything that would indicate danger. It smelled like home. My childhood home. The exact combination of my mother's cooking and my father's pipe tobacco and the specific detergent my family used. A smell I had not encountered in 30 years, since my parents sold that house and moved to Florida. My eyes started watering, not from emotion, from fear, because that smell should not exist here, could not exist here. But it was so real, so vivid, that I could almost hear my mother calling me for dinner, could almost see my father sitting in his favorite chair reading the evening paper. The temperature inside was wrong too. Not cold like it should be, not with the stove unlit. It was warm, comfortable, the exact temperature my parents kept their thermostat. I could hear sounds now, soft and distant, like a television playing in another room. The show my father watched every night after dinner. I spun around to leave and found the door closed behind me. I had not heard it shut, had not felt any breeze or movement. It was just closed, and when I grabbed the handle, it would not turn. The door was locked from the inside, just like the warning had said. But I had not locked it. I had not touched the lock at all. Something moved in my peripheral vision. I whirled, gun raised, and saw nothing but shadows shifting in the corner where the bunks were stacked. But the shadows were wrong, too dark, too thick, moving independently of any light source. They rippled across the wall like something liquid, like something alive. A voice spoke my name. My mother's voice, coming from the crawl space under the bunks. The same loving tone she used when I was a child, telling me dinner was ready, telling me to come down where it was safe and warm, telling me everything would be okay if I just came a little closer. But my mother had been dead for 5 years. The horrifying realization hit me like a sledgehammer. This was what the shelter did. This was why people ran. It learned you, read you, pulled out memories and fears and twisted them into something that looked like safety but was actually a trap. The warmth was not real. The smell was not real. My mother's voice was not real. But it felt real enough to make me want to believe it. I fired 3 shots into the lock. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, but the lock did not break. The bullets left marks, but the door remained sealed. I kicked it, beat on it with my shoulder. Nothing. The shelter held me like a prison cell, and the shadows in the corner were spreading, oozing across the floor toward me. More voices joined my mother, my father, my ex-wife, my partner who died in the line of duty 8 years ago. All calling to me from impossible places, from inside the wood stove, from behind the walls, from underneath the floorboards, all promising safety, warmth, rest, everything I needed if I would just stop fighting and accept what the shelter was offering. I understood then why the supplies were never touched, why the shelter sat unused despite being perfectly maintained. Because once you went inside, you did not want to leave. The fear that kept people away was the only thing that saved them. Those who were too exhausted or desperate or hypothermic to feel that instinctive terror would open the door, step inside, and never be seen again. The scratches on the back wall were not warnings carved by survivors. They were messages from people who had escaped, who had somehow broken free and wanted to leave evidence of what they had experienced, even knowing no one would believe them. I screamed. Not words, just raw sound, rage and terror and absolute refusal to die in this place. I grabbed the wood stove. The iron was scalding hot despite being unlit, and I swung it into the nearest window. Glass shattered. The frame splintered. Cold air rushed in, real air, mountain air that smelled like snow and pine instead of my childhood home. The voices howled. The shadows surged toward me. I dove through the broken window, felt glass tear my jacket and skin, hit the snow outside and rolled. Behind me, the door of the shelter swung open, and something that was definitely not my mother stood in the doorway, wearing her face like a mask, reaching for me with arms that were too long and bent at too many joints. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs collapsed. Ran until I could not hear the voices anymore or feel that crushing warmth trying to drag me back. I filed my report the next day, recommended the shelter be demolished. The State Park Service rejected the recommendation. Too expensive, they said. The structure was sound. The supplies were maintained. It provided a valuable safety resource. But they did add a new sign at mile marker 73. A small placard near the trail. It reads, "Emergency shelter ahead. Use at your own discretion." That is all. No warning, no explanation. Just discretion. Because what do you say? How do you warn people about a building that knows exactly what you need to hear, exactly what you need to see, Exactly what you need to feel to stop thinking rationally. How do you explain that safety itself can be predatory? The shelter is still there, still unused, still waiting, and somewhere, someone exhausted and freezing and desperate is going to see that red door and think they have found salvation. They are going to ignore the fear, ignore the scratches on the back wall, ignore every instinct that tells them something is wrong. They are going to step inside, and we will never find them. Winter doesn't erase events, it hides them. Story 9. Lake that was drained in spring. Have you ever wondered what truly lives at the bottom of a frozen lake? I know now, and I wish to God I didn't. Last spring, I helped drain Coldwater Lake in northern Minnesota. And what we found, or more terrifying, what we didn't find, has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. I am a hydrologist. For 15 years, they studied water systems across the Midwest, analyzing flow rates, testing quality, mapping underground aquifers. It is boring work, mostly scientific, predictable. At least, that is what I believed until March of last year when the county hired me to oversee the partial drainage of Coldwater Lake. The project seemed routine. The lake had been polluted by agricultural runoff, and the state wanted to drain 30% of the water, treat the sediment, and restore the ecosystem. Simple environmental cleanup. Nothing scary about it, nothing that should have kept me awake at night for the next 12 months. But Coldwater Lake was different from the start. The locals knew it, I just didn't listen. When I arrived in the small town of Millbrook, population 800 and dropping, the people at the diner went quiet when I mentioned the drainage project. An old farmer, weathered face creased with lines that spoke of hard winters and harder truths, leaned over and told me to leave the lake alone. He said some things are meant to stay buried beneath the ice. I laughed it off. Superstition, small-town legends, the kind of creepy stories people tell to entertain themselves in isolated places where nothing ever happens. I should have listened to that old man. I should have packed my equipment and driven back to Minneapolis that same day. But I didn't. And now I carry the weight of what I discovered. A horrifying secret that proves sometimes our worst nightmares aren't fiction at all. We began draining on March 23rd. The ice had melted 2 weeks earlier, unusual for that region, and the water was dark as oil, thick with algae and sediment. The drainage valves opened without issue, and water began flowing through the underground channels at precisely the rate my calculations predicted. Everything was textbook perfect. My team consisted of 6 people, 3 engineers, 2 environmental scientists, and me. We set up monitoring equipment, took baseline measurements, and settled in for what we expected to be a straightforward 2-week project. The first 3 days were unremarkable. The water level dropped steadily, about 4 feet per day. We documented the usual lake bottom debris, old fishing equipment, beer cans, a sunken rowboat, standard stuff. The team was relaxed, joking around, already planning what they do with their paychecks. I remember thinking this was one of the easiest jobs I'd ever supervised. On the 4th day, everything changed. I arrived at the site at dawn, coffee in hand, ready for another routine day of measurements and reports. But something was wrong immediately. The water level hadn't dropped overnight. In fact, it looked higher than it had been the previous evening. I checked the drainage system. It was running perfectly, pumping thousands of gallons per hour into the overflow channels. But the lake level was rising, not falling. My first thought was equipment malfunction, but every gauge, every sensor, every valve was functioning exactly as designed. The math was simple and undeniable. We were removing water at a specific rate. No significant rainfall had occurred. No tributaries fed into Coldwater Lake. Yet somehow, the water was increasing in volume, flowing up from the depths as if the lake itself was generating its own supply. I called in specialists from the State Water Authority. They brought advanced sonar equipment, depth mapping technology, and a lot of skepticism that evaporated within hours. Their instruments showed something impossible. According to historical surveys, Coldwater Lake was 53 feet deep at its deepest point. But when they sent down sonar, the signals kept bouncing back readings that made no sense. 70 feet, 90 feet, 120 feet. The depth kept changing, fluctuating as if the bottom itself was moving, breathing, alive. One of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been studying lakes for 20 years, went pale when she saw the readings. She told me, quietly so the others couldn't hear, that what we were seeing was physically impossible. Lakes don't change depth spontaneously. Water doesn't appear from nowhere. Something beneath the surface was wrong, disturbing in a way that violated natural law. That night, the nightmares started. I dreamed of dark water, of swimming down into depths that had no bottom, of shapes moving beneath me in the blackness. Shapes that were too large, too wrong, too aware of my presence. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the hotel room suddenly feeling too small, too enclosed. The fear was irrational but overwhelming, a primal terror that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. On day 7, we finally made progress. The water level dropped dramatically, falling 20 feet in 6 hours. It was as if whatever had been holding it back had suddenly released its grip. By afternoon, we could see the lake bed emerging, and that is when the true horror began. The bottom of Coldwater Lake wasn't mud and silt like it should have been. Instead, the exposed lake bed was smooth, almost glassy, like polished obsidian. It reflected the sky in ways that seemed wrong, distorted, showing clouds that weren't really there and colors that didn't exist in nature. Walking on it felt treacherous. My boots couldn't find purchase on that slick surface, and the texture made my skin crawl. It was too perfect, too unnatural, like we had uncovered something that had been deliberately hidden. Then we found the first structure. At first, I thought it was a rock formation, but as more of the lake drained, the truth became undeniable. It was a building, stone walls, intact roof, a doorway opening into darkness. And it wasn't alone. As the water continued to recede, more structures emerged, dozens of them. An entire settlement spread across the lake bed, perfectly preserved, impossibly ancient. I immediately checked every historical record I could access. Coldwater Lake had existed for at least 10,000 years, formed by glacial activity during the last ice age. No town had ever been flooded to create it. No settlement had ever existed in this valley. Yet here was undeniable evidence of human habitation, sitting where it absolutely could not be. The structures were unlike anything I had ever seen. The architecture was wrong, angles that hurt to look at, doorways that seemed to lead in impossible directions. The stone was covered in carvings, symbols that resembled no written language I recognized. They seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them, shifting and rearranging themselves like living things. We called in archaeologists, historians, and eventually federal investigators. The site was cordoned off. Military personnel arrived, which made no sense for an archaeological discovery. They set up a perimeter and began restricting access, even to those of us who had been there from the beginning. The whole situation took on a nightmarish, surreal quality. What had started as a simple environmental project had become something else entirely, something that powerful people wanted kept quiet. I managed to get inside one of the structures before they sealed the site completely. The interior was vast, far larger than the exterior suggested. The walls were covered in more of those disturbing symbols, and the air felt thick, heavy, like breathing through wet cloth. But what terrified me most was the smell. Not decay or mold or anything you'd expect from a building that had been underwater. It smelled like ozone, like the air after a lightning strike, sharp and electric and completely wrong. In the center of the main chamber, I found something that still haunts my dreams. A pool, a perfectly circular pool of water, maybe 10 feet across, sitting in the floor. The water was moving, swirling slowly despite no current or wind. And it was the wrong color, too dark, too thick. When I shined my flashlight into it, the beam didn't penetrate. The light just stopped at the surface, absorbed by whatever that liquid really was. I heard something then. A sound coming from the pool. Not quite a voice, not quite music, but something in between. It called to me in a language I didn't know but somehow understood. It promised things. Knowledge, power, understanding of mysteries that humanity had forgotten. All I had to do was step into the water. Just one step. Just surrender to the darkness and let it show me the truth. I ran. Pure instinct overrode curiosity and scientific interest. Every cell in my body screamed that I was in mortal danger, that whatever existed in that pool was predatory and patient and had been waiting for someone like me for a very, very long time. I stumbled out of the structure into the harsh sunlight, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. That evening, they evacuated everyone from the site. No explanation. No debriefing, just orders to pack up and leave immediately. Military trucks arrived to transport our equipment. Men in hazmat suits entered the structures. I watched from a distance as they set up strange equipment around the perimeter, devices that hummed with barely audible frequencies that made my teeth ache. The next morning, I returned to the lake against direct orders. I had to see. I had to know what they were doing. What I witnessed still gives me nightmares so vivid and terrifying that I just started sleeping with the lights on. They were refilling the lake, but not with water from the drainage channels. They had brought in tanker trucks, dozens of them, and were pumping something else into the lake bed. A dark, viscous liquid that spread across the obsidian surface like oil. And where it touched the structures, they began to dissolve, melting like wax in a furnace. The symbols on the walls glowed briefly with a sickly green light before fading to nothing. I watched through binoculars as the pool in the center of the main structure erupted. Something rose from it, something massive and impossible that defied description. I saw appendages that bent in wrong directions. I saw surfaces that reflected light in ways that hurt to perceive. I saw what might have been eyes, far too many eyes, turning in my direction despite the distance between us. Then the military opened fire. Not with conventional weapons, but with something that produced no sound, only a visual distortion in the air, like heat waves on a summer highway. Whatever had emerged from the pool writhed and collapsed back into the darkness. The glowing liquid continued pouring in, covering everything, erasing all evidence that the structures had ever existed. By afternoon, Coldwater Lake was full again. The obsidian surface was gone. The buildings were gone. The pool was gone. In their place was ordinary-looking muddy water, exactly what you'd expect to find at the bottom of a Minnesota lake. It was as if none of it had ever happened, as if the past 2 weeks had been a collective hallucination. I was detained for 3 days. Men in suits questioned me repeatedly, asking what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had touched. They made it clear that discussing any details of the project would result in serious legal consequences. National security, they said. Public safety, they said. They showed me documents to sign, agreements that bound me to silence under penalty of imprisonment. I signed everything. I just wanted to leave that place and never return. But they couldn't. To make me forget. They couldn't. To erase the memories of those structures, those symbols, that pool of darkness that had called to me with promises of terrible knowledge. And they couldn't. To explain what we had really found beneath Coldwater Lake. I spent the past year researching, carefully, quietly, using resources that can be traced back to me. I found references to similar sites. Ancient structures discovered at the bottom of lakes across the world, always quickly covered up, always denied, always erased from public record. There are patterns in the reports, similarities in the descriptions that suggest these places are connected somehow, part of a network of impossible architecture that exists in hidden spaces across the globe. The most disturbing thing they learned is that they were not empty. Whatever lived or lives in those structures is still there, waiting beneath the water, patient and immortal and utterly alien to human understanding. The settlements aren't to ruins. They were more like prisons, or maybe gates, barriers between our world and something else, something that exists in the spaces between reality that our minds aren't equipped to comprehend. Coldwater Lake is open to the public again. People fish there. Kids swim in the summer. No one knows what lies beneath that dark water. What horror was briefly exposed and then hastily resealed. The case officially remains unresolved. The drainage project was deemed a failure due to unforeseen geological complications. My team was disbanded. Our reports were classified. But I know the truth. We weren't supposed to drain that lake. Whatever was down there had been safely contained for millennia, hidden beneath ice and water and deliberate forgetting. We disturbed something that should have remained buried, exposed secrets that humanity abandoned long ago for very good reasons. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that sound. The not-quite voice from the pool, calling to me across the distance, patient and persistent. It knows my name now. It knows where I am. And I have the terrifying suspicion that one day, I'll wake up and find myself standing at the edge of Coldwater Lake, staring into those dark waters, unable to resist the urge to walk in and never come back. The lake that was drained in spring should have stayed frozen forever. What we expected to find was pollution and sediment. What we actually discovered was proof that the universe is far stranger and more horrifying than we imagine. That there are things older than humanity lurking in forgotten places, waiting for fools like me to open doors that should stay locked. The case remains unresolved because resolution would require admitting the truth, and the truth is something our civilization is ready to face. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some questions should never be asked, and some lakes should never, ever be drained. The final story remains unresolved to this day. Story 10. What was never written down. I found my father's journal 3 months after his funeral, hidden behind a false panel in his basement workshop, and what I read inside has kept me awake every night since. The journal documents a winter incident from 1991 that never appeared in any official records. An event so horrifying and inexplicable that everyone involved was sworn to silence. But my father broke that silence in his private writings, and now I understand why he spent the last 30 years of his life sleeping with every light in the house burning. My name is Michael Crane. I am 42 years old, a civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, living an ordinary life until I inherited my father's house and discovered the truth he carried alone for 3 decades. What happened in the winter of 1991 in a place called Coldwater Station was erased from history, scrubbed from newspapers, removed from police logs, and buried under layers of official denial. But the people who were there remember, the survivors remember, and their personal accounts tell a story of terror that defies everything we think we know about reality. My father, James Crane, was a geologist working for the United States Geological Survey. In February of 1991, he was part of a team sent to investigate unusual seismic activity in northern Montana, near the Canadian border. Coldwater Station was not really a town, just a weather research facility with a permanent staff of 12 people, isolated in the wilderness 40 miles from the nearest settlement. The facility had been reporting strange readings for weeks. Ground tremors that registered on no other equipment. Temperature fluctuations that made no meteorological sense. And sounds. Deep, resonant sounds coming from beneath the earth that their instruments could not properly measure. The journal begins on February 9, 1991. My father, his handwriting was steady at first, clinical and precise as he described the helicopter flight to the facility. But by the second page, I could see the words becoming more rushed, the letters less controlled. He was scared. Even in those early entries, before anything truly horrifying happened, he was already afraid. The facility sat in a valley surrounded by dense pine forest and mountains. Winter had buried everything under 6 feet of snow. The research station consisted of 4 main buildings connected by covered walkways, designed to withstand the brutal Montana winters. My father described arriving just before sunset, the sky turning deep purple, the temperature dropping to 15 below zero. The facility director, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, met them at the landing pad. My father wrote that her face was drawn, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, and her hands shook when she pointed them toward the main building. The team consisted of 5 people. My father, 2 other geologists named Marcus Webb and Jennifer Torres, a structural engineer named David Park, and their military liaison, a captain named Robert Hayes. They were there to determine if the facility was structurally sound, if the seismic activity posed any danger, and what was causing the anomalous readings. Dr. Chen briefed them that first night. The problems had started 6 weeks earlier. Minor tremors, barely noticeable. Then the sounds began. Low-frequency vibrations that the staff could feel more than hear. Animals in the area had fled. No birds, no deer, no wolves. The forest had gone completely silent. Then 3 days before the team arrived, something changed. The tremors stopped. The sound stopped. Everything went quiet. But that silence was worse than the disturbances. Dr. Chen described it as the silence of something holding its breath, waiting. My father wrote that he felt it immediately. An oppressive atmosphere that pressed down on the facility like a physical weight. The air inside the buildings felt thick, harder to breathe. Electronic equipment malfunctioned randomly. Lights flickered. Computers crashed. And everyone, all 12 permanent staff members, looked exhausted and terrified. The investigation began the next morning. They deployed seismic sensors in a grid pattern around the facility. They took core samples. They measured everything they could measure. And they found nothing that explained the readings. The ground beneath Coldwater Station was stable. No fault lines. No volcanic activity. No geological explanation for what had been happening. But on the second night, February 11th, everything changed. My father wrote that he was in his assigned quarters, trying to sleep, when he felt it. A vibration. Not in the ground, in the air itself. The walls of his room began to hum. His teeth ached, his vision blurred. He got up and looked out his window, and what he saw made him question his sanity. The snow was moving, not melting or shifting, moving, flowing across the ground like liquid, swirling in patterns that had no natural cause. And in that moving snow, shapes were forming. Human shapes, dozens of them, rising from the white surface like sculptures being carved by invisible hands. They stood motionless around the facility, perfect human figures made of snow, all facing the buildings. My father ran to wake the others. By the time they gathered in the common room, every window showed the same horrifying sight. Hundreds of snow figures now, some close enough to touch the glass. Others scattered across the valley, all perfectly still, all watching. Captain Hayes tried to radio for help. The communications equipment was dead. All of it, not malfunctioning, completely non-functional, as if every circuit had been fried simultaneously. They were cut off, isolated in the wilderness with something impossible happening outside. Dr. Chen broke down. She confessed that this had happened before. 3 nights earlier. The figures had appeared, stood silent until dawn, then collapsed back into formless snow when the sun rose. She had not reported it because she knew no one would believe her. But this time there were more of them. Many more. The team spent that night huddled in the common room, watching those figures through the windows. My father described the psychological horror of it. The figures did not move, did not threaten, just stood in the freezing darkness and watched. Hour after hour, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animal sounds, just that terrible stillness and hundreds of empty snow-formed eyes staring at the facility. Dawn came. The figures collapsed. One moment they were there, the next they were just piles of snow scattered across the valley. The team ventured outside to investigate. The snow showed no footprints, no indication that anything had been standing there. But my father noticed something that made his blood run cold. Each pile of snow was positioned exactly where a figure had stood. And when they measured the snow depth, they found indentations beneath each pile. As if something real had been standing there. As if the snow figures had weight. They tried to leave that day. Captain Hayes argued they needed to evacuate immediately, get everyone out before nightfall. But the weather turned. A blizzard swept in from nowhere, visibility dropping to 0, wind howling through the valley at 80 miles per hour. The helicopter could not fly. They were trapped. The third night was worse. The figures appeared again, but this time they moved. Slowly, incrementally. Each time someone looked away and looked back, the figures had gotten closer to the buildings. My father described the creeping horror of watching something approach in slow motion, unable to do anything to stop it. By midnight, figures were pressed against every window. Featureless faces made of snow, inches from the glass, motionless but somehow conveying an intent that felt malevolent. Then Marcus Webb made a mistake. Stressed and terrified, he opened a door to prove the figures were not real, that they were just snow formations. He stepped outside. My father wrote that Marcus took 3 steps into the darkness, then stopped. His body went rigid. Frost spread across his clothes with unnatural speed. His skin turned pale, then blue, then white. In less than 10 seconds, Marcus Webb became a snow figure. A perfect replica of himself, standing frozen in the doorway. They pulled him inside. His body was ice cold but still alive. Barely. His heart beat once every 30 seconds. His lungs moved once per minute. He was in some kind of suspended state. Frozen but not dead. They wrapped him in blankets, tried to warm him, but his temperature would not rise. He remained frozen, eyes open, staring at nothing. Dr. Chen revealed more of what she knew. 4 weeks earlier, one of her staff members had disappeared, a meteorologist named Tom Price. He had gone outside to check equipment and never came back. They found his body the next morning, frozen solid in the snow, skin turned completely white. But his body never thawed, never decayed. It remained in the facility morgue, frozen at room temperature, defying all biological logic. My father wrote that they finally understood they were dealing with something beyond science. This was not a geological phenomenon. This was something else. Something that existed in the cold, that could manipulate ice and snow, that could reach out and freeze living tissue in seconds. Something ancient and vast that had been disturbed by the research facility, this presence. The 4th night was the worst. My father, his handwriting became almost illegible, words scratched onto the page in desperate haste. The figures came again, but this time they brought others. Human figures mixed with shapes that were not human. Twisted forms that hurt to look at. Geometries that made no sense. And they did not wait outside. They began to manifest inside the facility. Temperature dropped in every room. Frost spread across walls and ceilings. Windows cracked from the cold. And in the shadows, figures began to take shape. Staff members started seeing things. A woman made of ice standing in the bathroom mirror. A child-sized figure crouched in a corner, made of frost and shadow. Hands pressed against the inside of walls, fingers spreading out beneath the surface as if something was trying to push through from somewhere else. Jennifer Torres was the next to be taken. She was in the laboratory when they heard her scream. By the time my father and the others reached her, she was frozen mid-stride, running toward the door, face locked in an expression of absolute terror. Her body was rigid, skin white, eyes turned to ice. That was when Dr. Chen finally revealed everything. The facility had been built on top of something. 3 years earlier, during initial construction, they had broken through into an underground cavity. A natural formation, they thought. But the cavity was too regular, too symmetrical. It looked manufactured, and it went down far deeper than their equipment could measure. They had sealed it and built the facility anyway. But something lived down there. Something that had been dormant for perhaps thousands of years. And the facility, its presence, the vibrations from their equipment, the constant human activity, had woken it up. Captain Hayes made a decision. They had to destroy the facility, cut off whatever connection existed between the building and the cavity below. He had demolition charges, standard military equipment for emergency situations. They would blow the main structure, evacuate to the storage building 200 yards away, and wait for rescue in the morning. They moved quickly, set the charges, gathered supplies, prepared to abandon the facility. But the presence, whatever it was, knew what they were planning. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero. The air itself began to crystallize, frost forming in their lungs with every breath. And the figures came, not snow formations this time. Real, solid entities, things made of ice and darkness that moved with purpose and hunger. My father described the terror of that escape, running through the darkness with Captain Hayes, Dr. Chen, and 2 other surviving staff members. David Park had frozen while setting charges. 3 more staff members had been taken while gathering supplies. Only 6 people remained. They ran through the blizzard as the facility exploded behind them. Fire and ice mixing in an impossible conflagration that lit up the valley. They reached the storage building, barricaded themselves inside, and waited. The things circled outside. My father could hear them moving through the snow, sounds that were not footsteps but something else. Sliding, scraping, like massive forms dragging across frozen ground. Dawn came, the sun rose, and everything stopped. The cold receded, the things outside vanished. When they finally ventured out, the facility was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Where 4 buildings had stood, there was only smooth, undisturbed snow. As if nothing had ever been there. The helicopter arrived 2 hours later. They were evacuated, taken to a military facility, debriefed by men in suits who recorded everything and then told them that nothing had happened. No incident at Coldwater Station. No deaths, no investigation. They were threatened with prosecution if they ever spoke about it. Their families were threatened. Every piece of evidence was confiscated and classified. But my father kept his journal, his personal account, and over the years, he found others. Survivors of similar incidents. Places where the ground opened and something cold and ancient reached up into our world. Events that were erased from official records but lived on in the memories and private writings of those who experienced them. The journal ends with a warning. My father believed that what happened at Coldwater Station was not unique. He believed there were places all over the world, remote places, cold places, where the barrier between our reality and something else was thin. Where in the deep winter darkness, things could reach through. And he believed these incidents were increasing. He spent 30 years researching, collecting accounts, tracking patterns. He found records of other facilities that simply disappeared, research stations that went silent, towns that were evacuated with no explanation. Always in winter, always in remote locations, always followed by official silence and denial. I have continued his research. I have contacted other survivors. And I have discovered something that keeps me awake at night, that makes me check my windows every evening, that has convinced me to tell this story despite the risks. Last winter, 3 research facilities went dark. 1 in Alaska, 1 in Siberia, 1 in northern Canada. Official explanations varied: equipment failure, weather evacuations, routine closures. But I have found people who were there, people who survived, and their personal accounts match my father's journal exactly. The snow figures, the impossible cold, the things that live in darkness and ice. Whatever exists in those deep, frozen places is waking up. And the official policy of denial and erasure means that when it spreads, when it reaches populated areas, we will be unprepared. We will not know what we are facing until it is too late. This is what was never written down. This is the truth that governments hide behind classified files and threaten silence. Something ancient and cold exists beneath the frozen earth. Something that can reach into our world and take us into its realm of endless winter. Something that is patient and vast and utterly indifferent to human life. My father survived Cold Water Station, but it destroyed him. He never felt warm again. Never stopped checking the shadows. Never stopped looking for others who remembered what official history erased. And now I understand why. Because once you know the truth, once you understand that there are things moving in the darkness beneath the snow, you can never feel safe again. I am telling this story because someone must. Because personal accounts are all that remain when official records are destroyed. Because the survivors deserve to have their experiences acknowledged, even if the world refuses to believe. If you live in a remote area and you notice animals fleeing in winter, if you hear deep vibrations coming from beneath the ground, if the snow begins to move in patterns that make no sense, leave immediately. Do not wait. Do not investigate. Just go. Because what happened at Cold Water Station in the winter of 1991 never officially occurred. But it was real. The people who died there were real. And the thing that killed them is still out there, waiting in the frozen darkness for the next time someone disturbs its ancient sleep. My father's final journal entry was written 3 weeks before his death. Just one sentence, repeated over and over across the entire page. It is still watching. It will always be watching. The cold never forgets. I believe him. And now, so will you.